that power in right away. Good. Welcome, everyone. Good to see so many clocking in. We'll wait a few more minutes before we start to let everybody log on, but looks like the queue is filling up nicely. Nice to see some familiar names. David, maybe wait another minute or so.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
A couple minutes past, shall we begin?
Sure. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us for this evening's presentation. My name is David Corey. I'm a faculty member in Humanities, Modern Languages, and Global Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, and I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Stoll, who is the Associate Dean of Global Affairs at St. Norbert College. And so welcome tonight to our fifth in our Great Decisions lectures. Before we introduce this evening's guest, I just wanted to remind you we have one more Great Decisions lecture coming up on Wednesday, April the 14th. Alan Schell of UW-Madison, a graduate student, PhD candidate there, will be speaking about China's role in Africa. So you can find the registration on St. Norbert's website for that. And then we also just organized another event. It's not part of the Great Decisions, but will be a collaborative event sponsored by UW Green Bay and St. Norbert College on Friday, April the 30th. This one at 1 p.m. And we're very pleased to welcome Fahad Nazar, who's the official spokesperson of the Saudi Embassy in Washington, D.C. And he will be speaking about U.S.-Saudi relations and the reform program that the Saudi government has put in place. So it'll be a very similar type of event as this one, in which, and that brings us back to tonight's talk, that we encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A. And then after our talk, we will, Dan and I will moderate those questions and ask them then to Professor Garvey. I also wanted to remind everybody that we are recording tonight's event, so we hope you're okay with that, and it will be posted on St. Norbert's website. So Dr. Stoll, over to you.
David, thank you. And again, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining the fifth in our series. As you know, it's our tradition to have a St. Norbert student introduce our speakers. So tonight, the honor goes to Sydney Oland. She is a chemistry major here at the college. There's the picture. After Sydney's done the introduction, Neil will be talking to us for 35 minutes, and then questions and answers to follow. So, Sydney.
Neil McGarvey teaches British and Scottish politics in the University of Strathclyde-Glasgow, Scotland. He has previously visited St. Norbert College in Green Bay on the International Visiting Scholar Program in 2016 and thoroughly enjoyed the warmth and hospitality of residents, staff, and students at both institutions while staying in De Pere. He has written widely in the fields of Scottish politics, territorial politics in the UK, Brexit, and the European Union. He co-authored the leading textbook on Scottish politics and continues to publish in the field of Scottish government and politics. He is a member of the Scottish Parliament Research Group and has presented papers at conferences across Europe, Asia, Australia, and the US. It is our pleasure to welcome Dr. Neil McGarvey.
Thank you very much, Sydney. And it's great to be back here. Well, I say back. I'm like a time traveller here. It's 12:30 on the 1st of April here in Glasgow, Scotland. And I'm travelling back to the 31st of March in Green Bay. But what I'm going to speak to you about tonight, well, first of all, you may have noticed the accent. And apologies in advance, the Scottish accent can be quite difficult at times, but I'll do my best to enunciate as best us Glaswegians can, and hopefully you can follow me. But anything that you don't follow, please feel free to ask any questions or repeat myself. It's no problem whatsoever. So what I'm going to look at today, I've sort of borrowed the title somewhat from your previous leader, because Brexit really does link into a lot of the sort of Trump populist politics that you guys have experienced in the US. You know, Brexit is almost like our version of it. So the title of this evening's talk is Brexit making Britain great again? So I've chosen to structure it in 5 parts. Basically, I'm going to give you a very brief rundown on Britain's relationship with the European Union when it was a member, look at the decision itself, and then, but the key focus of the talk really is the aftermath of the decision and the implications of the decision for the United Kingdom's constitution, its domestic politics, but also thinking more globally of what the decision may mean for the EU and for British foreign policy as well. So part 1, very brief history of the United Kingdom and the European Union. Now, United Kingdom was not one of the founding members of the European Economic Community, and indeed it was almost 2 decades after its initial formation that Britain chose to join in 1973. And even only 2 years after it did join, it chose to have a referendum to make sure it wanted to stay in. So the 2016 referendum on EU membership was actually the second referendum that Britain had held on membership. So joined in 73, held the referendum 75. That referendum gave quite a categorical yes to remaining inside what was then called the European Economic Community. Now, the colloquial phrase used at that point for the European Economic Community in Britain was the common market. That sort of morphed into the single market by the late 1980s, early 1990s. But it's an important point to make that the phraseology that tended to be used for Europe or the European Union in Britain tended to emphasize its economic rather than its political dimension. You know, it was about economic integration, a single market, the benefits of free trade within Europe. You know, that was how it tended to be discussed by political elites, by the media in Britain. And what occurred over the course of the 80s and 90s and noughties was that a lot of British politicians tended to be critical of the European Union when it was politically expeditious to do so. You know, and Britain really wasn't what you could call Britain didn't see itself at the core of Europe, and over the course of the decades chose a series of opt-outs of various dimensions of integration, you know, that were viewed as more political than economic. So the social chapter, the Schengen Accord, which allowed for the free movement of peoples across borders in Europe, Britain chose to remain detached from Europe in a way. Now, that change or was supposed to change with the election of the Blair government back in 1997, who talked about putting Britain at the heart of Europe. That never quite materialised. Britain didn't join the single currency, the euro. It retained pound sterling, still does to this day, of course. So Europe has very much been an ongoing issue in British politics throughout the decades. David Cameron, we're going through prime ministers. I'm trying to think, I think he was the not the last Prime Minister, but the one previous to that, from 2010 to 2016. But when he was first elected as Conservative leader, Cameron and talked about that the Conservative Party had to change, because whilst parents were worried about childcare, getting their kids to school, balancing work and family life, the Conservative Party continued to bang on about Europe. It has always been a major issue within the Conservative Party. It's always had a very significant, what was called Eurosceptic wing, who were very sceptical of the benefits of membership of the European Union. And that contingent of MPs dogged Cameron whilst he was in office. And finally, he succumbed to the demand to put the referendum in the 2015 general election manifesto. Now, the expectation back in 2015 was that the Conservatives would not win a majority at that election, but they did. And that meant that the referendum was going to happen. But so the Europe was quite a significant issue within the Conservative Party, but whether it was in the public at large is much more debatable. These are the prior to the 2015 elections, the electorate in both England and Wales and Scotland were asked what their key issues were in the election. And just looking at the chart, you can see that Europe features somewhat down the list of issues behind the more bread and butter issues of the economy, immigration, healthcare, poverty, housing, and the like. So a whole host of issues were prioritised by the general public in Britain before Europe. But despite that, the referendum did take place. So moving on to part two of the talk, the referendum takes place back in 2016, and the UK overall votes by 51.9% to 48.1% to leave Europe. 17.4 million votes to 16.1 million votes. But importantly, there was a significant variation in that vote throughout the constituent parts of the United Kingdom. United Kingdom is made up of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. If you look at the second picture on that graph, it's not difficult to discern where the border between England and Scotland is. Scotland is all yellow, indicating that every region in Scotland voted to remain inside the European Union. England, Wales, much more variable. Northern Ireland, sort of more yellow than blue, indicating the fact that the different territories of the United Kingdom voted differently. Despite the overall vote being 52 to 48%, Scotland quite categorically by 62 to 38% voted to remain inside the European Union. Northern Ireland also voted to remain inside the European Union by I think it was 56 to 44%. But England and Wales, very similar results in England and Wales, round about that sort of 53 to 47 and 52 to 48. So, but that fact is important and was important moving forward, right? So what happens in the aftermath? Well, the immediate aftermath of that Brexit referendum, was very much chaos, uncertainty, a sense of crisis, particularly in the early days. Back in, I think it was July of 2016, a degree of, well, hang on a second, what do we do here? We have voted to leave the European Union, but parts of the United Kingdom have voted to remain. And the vote's not it's not that clear cut. It's 52-48. So, but in any case, what happens almost immediately is Prime Minister Cameron resigns, basically because he had been on the Remain side of that campaign, and reflecting the fact he was on the losing side, chose to resign. But you've also got economic impact, the collapse of sterling. There's so a lot of and it immediately becomes apparent that, rather bizarrely, there's been almost no contingency planning for this vote. That no one knows what they're going to do. The Conservative Party elect a new leader. She subsequently becomes Prime Minister due to the Conservatives having a majority in the House of Commons at that point. Theresa May was quite a short-lived Prime Minister, but she did trigger Article 50, which basically set in motion the process of the UK leaving the European Union, and decides that in order to basically strengthen her hand in negotiations with the EU, to hold a UK general election in 2017. Rather unexpectedly, the Conservative Party lose their majority at that UK general election, but still emerge as the largest party. But there's a hung parliament from 2017 to 2019, and throughout that whole period, there is an ongoing sort of dispute over who was controlling the process of Brexit. Should it be the political executive, the government? Should it be the legislature, the parliament? It all ended up in the Supreme Court. Because then there's a question of, well, should there be another referendum once we decide what type of exit we want to have from the EU, and what should the role of the territorial administrations be? There is a Scottish government, a Scottish Parliament, Welsh government, Welsh Parliament, Northern Ireland executive and Parliament. So what would their role should be? Now, moving forward, the territorial administrations played no significant role in the Brexit process itself, largely because what happens is that due to her inability to push through her agreement through Parliament, Theresa May resigns as Prime Minister, and there's another Conservative leadership contest, and that's where you get Boris Johnson coming in. He subsequently decides that he's going to have another general election in order to try to achieve a majority in the House of Commons. So in December 2019, he does achieve that majority and decides to pursue what generally is referred to as a hard Brexit rather than a soft Brexit. Hard in the sense that he's going to take Britain not only out with the single market, but also out with the customs union of the EU. So a very significant sort of almost a change in the previous sort of suggestion that Britain would remain somewhat attached to Europe despite the vote, or largely because of the closeness of the vote. Right, now, why did Brexit happen, or what does it reflect? I mean, in some way, you're almost seeing the constituent parts of the United Kingdom, the English, the Scottish, the Welsh, and the Irish, their identity becoming more pronounced, and that impacting on things politically. There was a survey done back in a couple of years ago when the individuals who identified primarily as English, it was noted, were much more likely to vote Leave in England. 70% of people who primarily identified as English voted Leave. The opposite was the case of English individuals who primarily identified as British. Now, over 70% of them had voted Remain. And so there is something going on. The study of English identity, English nationalism, has probably until the past decade been a rather alien enterprise for scholars of British politics. No one really sort of discussed or worried too much about it. I mean, when I was growing up, that sort of English and British almost were used interchangeably, but that is no longer the case. In a sense, the notions of Englishness and notions of Britishness have started to diverge. Those Britishness tends to sit most comfortably with perhaps the better educated, the better paid, those with a bit more of a global outlook. Whereas Englishness tends to be associated perhaps with those who are more nostalgic about English or British history, are anti-globalist in a sense, and often referred to as what sociologists would call the left behinds of society, those that have a very restricted worldview, that tend to live out with the major cities in England, and perhaps the cities that have struggled with deindustrialization and economically. You know, probably the best quote, and don't worry, I'm not going to use bad language here, Anthony Barnett, in a book called The Lure of Greatness, England's Brexit and America's Trump. Unable to exit Britain, the English did the next best thing and told the EU to flop off, So that's sort of sums up sort of that perspective. So that's England, but what's going on in the other parts? Now, I'm not going to mention Wales too much, largely, well, not at all really, because Wales voted in much the same way as England, and that there hasn't been too much going on in Wales. But I am going to talk about Ireland and Scotland now. That survey I mentioned earlier back in 2008, they were asked, what would the unravelling of the peace process in Northern Ireland be a price worth paying for Brexit? 83% of Leave voters said yes, and 61% of those voters said they were not at all or not concerned if Brexit led to a united Ireland. So this again reflecting this sort of small, some would say little England or little Britain view of the world. Now, Ireland, Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland peace process has been I mean, we can perhaps talk about more about it in questions, but the outcome of what would happen to the Irish border was a very, very significant issue in Brexit negotiations, because part of the Good Friday Peace Agreement was that there should be no hard border on the island of Ireland, and that becomes very complicated because the Republic of Ireland has obviously remained inside the European Union, but it was Northern Ireland's due to leave it. Now, the solution has been that largely that there are interim arrangements in place at the moment, but the trade border almost looks as if it will be in the medium to longer term in the Irish Sea rather than on the island of Ireland. Right. Now, that same October 2018 survey, Leave voters suggested 88% of them agreed that Scottish independence would be a price worth paying for Brexit. So, again, reflective of that English nationalism. Now, what we've seen when I was at St Norbert's in Green Bay back in 2016, I think I did a lecture on the independence referendum in Scotland that had taken place in 2014. In that referendum, 55% of the Scottish electorate voted to remain inside the inside the UK, 45% against. And the expectation was that the Brexit referendum was going to have a significant impact on preferences. Contrary to that expectation, and despite 62% of Scots wanting to remain inside the EU and been taken out with the EU against their will, opinion polls largely didn't move. Well, not until very recently. The green line there is remain inside the UK, and the blue line is in favour of Scottish independence. And what you can see is that the crossover really doesn't take place until about March or April of 2020. And that crossover was not so much about Brexit. It may have been partially about Brexit, but that was much more to do with the handling of the COVID pandemic in Scotland and the UK. Just to cite this figure, just to illustrate this, how much confidence, if any, do you have in the following to make the right decisions when it comes to the coronavirus outbreak? Survey of the Scottish electorate. As you can see, Boris Johnson is not a particularly popular figure in Scotland, never has been. Whereas the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, comes out of those type. I mean, that survey is broadly representative of the surveys that have been taking place since March of 2020, and under the arrangements for governance in the UK, Scotland actually has devolved powers as regards public health, and the Scottish government has not followed the same path in terms of the rules that the public should follow as the government of the UK that governs England. That each of the constituent parts of the UK have followed different paths. none of them have been particularly successful at suppressing the virus and stopping deaths. The UK, in European terms, has been sadly amongst the worst affected of European states. Right. So, what does this all mean for the constitutional future of the United Kingdom? Brexit really had no consent amongst any of the elected devolved institutions in Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland. But as I said, it's proved not to be the constitutional game changer that many had anticipated. The Scottish government did seek to have a new referendum in 2017. Theresa May's response that now was not the time, but it's very much a live issue today. There's a new Scottish Parliament election taking place. Can I say it's not quite next month for you guys? You're still in March. It's next month now for me because it's in May. But so that there's a May 2021 election. That is the issue in that election. You know that there are parties. The parties campaigning for independence are have very much been in the ascendancy over the past year or so. So at present, the UK, as you could say, another important thing is the powers that have been repatriated from Brussels from the EU have come directly back to the UK government, despite many of those powers under the devolved arrangements being devolved to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have lots of powers over the environment, over agriculture, over fisheries, over trading in markets, but those powers have to date come back to the UK government. So there's been a sort of re-centralisation of the union that has caused a lot of controversy. So, I mean, more broadly speaking, I think what you're saying is that the notion of Britishness or Britain, I mean, historically, the benefits of being British in Britain were very real back in the 18th and 19th and 20th century when Britain was becoming the first European industrial nation, when Britain had an empire, when economic, it was the one of the global powers, you know. But the idea that obviously Britain no longer has an empire, it's no longer a major global player, and that there was almost an unthinking banality of acceptance of being British back then, but now being Britishness tends to be expressed through institutions, the monarchy, government, parliament, the BBC, the National Health Service. And what's been happening in recent decades in Britain is that each of those institutions is beginning to take on a territorial dimension. Government is no longer solely in London. Devolution in terms of the establishment of a Scottish Parliament happened back in 1999. The BBC has significant regionalisation within Britain. The National Health Service, the responsibility for the National Health Service, very obviously the most important public policy of the past year or so, is actually with the Scottish rather than the UK government. So that previously thought of as a UK National Health Service has now become territorialised, you know, and that so Scottish, English, Welsh, Irish dimensions of governance or nationalism have become accentuated in recent years. Okay, final part 5, looking at, well, what does this all mean in terms of its broader significance? Now, it's very difficult to say that Brexit has done anything beyond weaken the sort of the power of Britain. That said, the proponents of Brexit have argued for that Britain will emerge from the EU as this new global free trading power. The Foreign Office, the UK Foreign Office, just released a new global Britain document last week. And really what it's suggesting is that there's going to be a real pivot in British foreign and British trade policy away from Europe towards Indochina, Indo-Pacific. That there's really going to be a very significant change in policy there. Economically, the economic effects of Brexit are obviously not quite apparent yet, and we've got all mixed in with COVID. But even the UK government's own assessment of the economic impact is not positive. So no one is making a case to say that Britain in the short to medium term is going to be economically, it's going to be beneficial for the UK. The European Union, to a degree, emerges as a weaker institution from the process because it's lost one of its major powers within Europe. It's left weakened in terms of population terms, in terms of its budget, and perhaps even its sort of global influence. Now, I can't sort of talk about Brexit without mentioning the global pandemic that has obviously impacted in almost every way across the globe. And basically, the COVID-19 pandemic has pushed Brexit off the front pages of and the policy agenda in Britain for the past year or so. Sadly, as I said earlier, Britain is amongst, in terms of the larger states in Europe, Britain is the worst affected and has been the worst affected in terms of deaths. 126,000 from a population, I think 66 million. That's the highest percentage, and the economy has taken a massive hit because of the economic lockdowns that have taken place over the past year in the United Kingdom. That said, the UK is likely to emerge first from its lockdown. There's a third wave going on across Europe at the moment. The UK has largely been sheltered from that because the vaccine program in the UK is much more advanced than the rest of Europe. I looked at the figures today. 31 million within the UK have had their first jab. Almost all individuals that are aged 50 or above. The vaccination program is very centrally managed here, but it's managed in that the older you are, the more likely you are to be vaccinated. First, the over 80s were done first, over 70s, over 60s, and now we're at the over 50s, and we're about to go to the over 40s. So, and what you're seeing is the hospitalisation and death rates, thankfully, are falling quite markedly. Okay, final slide. Right, so what does this mean? I think it's Britain does not is not as unified as it once was. Today Britain is an amalgam of 4 different smaller nations. And you could say, if you think of the European Union, part of the purpose of the European Union, what the Treaty of Rome suggested, that Europe was going to become an ever closer political union. In a sense, the UK has in recent decades become an ever looser political union. But that said, Brexit has now taken place. Britain has left the European Union. It's about to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. It's emerging intact, but at this juncture, Brexit is almost adding to the woes of the COVID-19 pandemic. That it could it could signal the end of Britain. I know, as a social scientist, we're not meant to make predictions. Only economists make predictions, and they're usually quite dismal. Right? So, but bugger it, we're in the midst of a global pandemic. So I thought, okay, bugger the rules. Let's. I will make a couple of predictions. I would say that a Scottish referendum, a second independence referendum, is very, very probable. The Scottish government have just published a bill that they would, and that are seeking to hold a referendum within the next 2 years. So by 2023, that's likely to be a major political issue at Scottish and UK level, and even over in Ireland. The Irish border referendum may well be a bit longer down the road, but even within the the next decade or so, that is beginning to look possible because of the fallout of Brexit on the politics within Northern Ireland as well. So has Brexit made Britain great again? Sadly not. I would think in the longer term it's very unlikely to, and it's actually probably more likely to lead towards the breakup of the United Kingdom. So that's all. Hopefully I've stayed sort of broadly in time, and I would welcome any questions. Thanks, guys. I'll just take the share off.
Wonderful. Thank you, Neil. That was great. And we do have quite a number of questions already popping up here. And you've touched certainly on a couple of them, but several people have asked what you concluded with about the possibility of a Scottish referendum and also the reunification of Ireland. And I know that you said only economists make predictions, but one of the questions is, what do you foresee that meaning for an independent Scotland?
Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, as I showed, that the polls actually on an independent Scotland were stuck at the 55-45 figure that the original referendum in 2014 had, but they have shifted rather dramatically in the past year or so, largely in response to the pandemic, and the handling of the pandemic has been a major issue. But there's still a long way to go. I mean, the elections that are going to take place in May, the key issue there is, will a majority on the floor of the Scottish Parliament emerge from those elections? In all likelihood, it will, you know. Now, then you're in, but the UK government, the Boris Johnson-led government, has to date said that they would not be willing to allow a second independence referendum. Unlike David Cameron back in 2011, after the Scottish National Party had gained the majority in the Scottish Parliament, was pretty flexible, pretty pragmatic, and basically agreed that they had every right, they had a mandate to have a referendum by virtue of having a majority in the Scottish Parliament. Boris Johnson's government's position is not likely to be as accommodating as that, you know. But then I suspect it's likely to end up in the courts about who has the right to host that referendum. Now, obviously, I mean, I'm sure some of you are aware of what's going on in Catalonia with Spain and the sort of the referendum that was held. Yeah, I don't think we're going to get to that situation in the UK, you know, in Scotland, but a lot depends on how large the majority is after the May 2021 elections in Scotland.
Neil, a couple of questions about possible Russian involvement in the Brexit vote, and possibly through social media swaying that vote in the UK. Was there such influence, and if so, to what extent did that have an impact on the final vote, do you think?
I think it would be naive to say that there wasn't any Russian influence, but I can't claim any. I mean, a level of intelligence on that to say. I mean, it's. I would say I think money played a much larger role in that vote, in terms of there seemed to be a lot of what you call the Leave side, the Leave side, and that the Brexit referendum seemed to be not so much the official Leave side, but there was a lot of unofficial, unregulated expenditure going on. You know, I don't think that would be Russian expenditure, you know, but I think in social media terms, I mean, Britain is a very strange place in terms of its media, because a lot of the media ownership in Britain is foreign, you know, or they would claim to be British, but they don't live in Britain. They live in some tax-free island somewhere, and they try. I mean, Rupert Murdoch is probably, News International is the best example. He quite openly says he campaigned against the EU. Why? Because the UK government listens to him. The EU government will simply just ignore him. has no time for him. You know, so his newspapers actively campaigned against the EU. You know, as did a lot of the newspapers, but I mean, they played a role. You know, I'm drifting off the question, of course, here. I've just realised. So I think it'd be naive to disregard that the notion that Russia had an influence. It did, to be honest, but I'd be guessing as to the extent of that influence, but they undoubtedly played a role.
Great. We have another question about something that's made a lot of news here in the United States, and that's the increased regulations after Brexit. That, you know, there were all of these reports of trucks, lorries being lined up in Calais, and then also on the British side. And what somebody asked what the origin sort of all of this onerous paperwork and bureaucracy, and sort of how do things stand now as far as dealing with some of these issues.
Okay, I mean, it's pretty simple. The UK was in the single market, and as soon as it left the EU, it moved itself out with that single market, and it moved itself out with the sort of the customs union as well. And therefore, from an EU perspective, in legal terms, the UK became the same as any other nation state in the world that wasn't inside the European Union, and therefore, the free flow of goods and parts and everything that goes on simply, I mean, wasn't taking place. Don't get me wrong, I suspect there could well have been much better contingency planning, but negotiations were ongoing for an agreement right up until, I think, Christmas of 2020. Britain left on the 31st of December of 2020. So the notion that you could then get the apparatus in place within 5 or 6 days during a holiday period in the midst of a global pandemic and lockdown, I mean, that's largely the causal factor of the chaos that was entirely predicted then. But what you've seen is that, particularly in Ireland, the ferry ports in Ireland, the goods and services used to pass through Britain, but now the Irish goods are going directly to Europe via a very long route. But it did, and it continues to cause a lot of problems. There are businesses, particularly in Scotland, that relied on exports of fisheries and agricultural produce to Europe, and that have almost gone to the wall simply because of the problems that they had in terms of bureaucracy and trade and the like. And Britain, as I said, Britain's even created Britain. I don't think I mentioned it in the presentation. Britain is the first state to enter free trade discussions and emerge from them with a smaller market than its own size, because Northern Ireland has effectively moved out with the UK. That's still attached to the EU because of the border issue in Ireland. So, in effect, if you're in Northern Ireland, you have you're sort of half inside the UK and half inside the EU, you know, at the moment. But there's ongoing. I mean, that again is. I have a friend who literally has just retired, and he basically tells me he's now working 1 day a week sorting out the bureaucracy of the Scottish-Irish ferry routes, because now even to send something from Scotland to Northern Ireland is now a bureaucratic exercise, despite technically they're both inside the UK. You know,
Neil, thank you. Could you perhaps provide more context around the decision to remain in the pound, to keep the pound sterling and not adopt the euro?
Okay, right. But that decision goes back actually to the I'm trying to think when the euro started. I think it was the late 1990s. Now there was a suggestion. I mean, looking back, it was anticipated when Tony Blair was elected as a Labour leader back in 1997 that Britain would actually join the euro. That was the anticipation at the time. But Gordon Brown, who was the Prime Minister after Tony Blair, set up a series of checks or tests, I think it's Britain has got the Foreign Office of Britain and the the idea of Britain as the Commonwealth, which is basically all the countries that used to be in the empire, apart from the US, of course. Britain still has an attachment to sort of that, and I think that reflects probably that the view that joining a single currency would involve the emasculation of a lot of political power to European institutions. That, in a sense, Britain never really bought into the European project as to the same degree as the French or the Germans or even the Italians or the Spanish. You know, and if you go back further, Britain didn't really get impacted to the same degree by World War II as mainland Europe. Mainland Europe, if you like, was the battlefield, you know, whereas Britain, I mean, the Britain wasn't invaded by the Nazis then. So, I mean, it was bombed, of course, but it didn't have the same impact on Britain. And I think the island status, it's, I mean, I am trying to get into the minds of the British government and the British Foreign Office, and I'm probably not being very good at it, I have to say. But I think it just reflects the history of Britain being that awkward partner in Europe, never quite buying into the project. You know, being willing to share the economic benefits of it in terms of free trade, a European single market, which undoubtedly benefited the British as well as the German and French and Italian economies, but never quite buying into the notion that should involve much more political agreement and or the idea of the idea of a federal Europe. There's always been a skepticism of the notion, or the danger that Brussels could become the sort of almost like the Washington of Europe, you know, and a lot of antagonism towards that in the UK.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good.
We have another question that has to do with another very timely topic, namely the AstraZeneca vaccine. And how much do you think the current Brexit situation has impacted some of the problems with AstraZeneca and the reluctance of Europeans and the European Union to take the vaccine?
Okay. Now, the vaccination has been a big issue in Europe, obviously, because Britain got so far ahead of the rest of the EU, largely because of the contracts that it drew up with the pharmaceutical companies. The AstraZeneca, I mean, I'm probably getting into an issue which I'm not a big expert on, but I mean, AstraZeneca I've taken what we call over here the Oxford virus, right? That was developed, and part of the agreement was it should be free. You know, call me cynical, but large pharmaceutical companies with a competitor who's doing it for free, you know, let's talk them down. I mean, the UK government has gone ahead with all the AstraZeneca vaccinations. There is no data in the UK that it's caused any problem. I've had an AstraZeneca vaccination. I mean, there are 2 vaccination programs going on in the UK. I think they're both of roughly equal size. Is it Pfizer is the other one? But the European governments have, I mean, limited the use of AstraZeneca on the basis of some data that they have. But I have to say, I'm skeptical of that it's problematic. You know, that I think all the vaccinations, the data that I've seen for them all, they all tend to show up very well. And I wouldn't be cynical or skeptical of any of them. Yeah.
So Neil, one of our participants has noted that you've only touched on immigration to some extent, but how will Brexit influence some of that debate within the UK moving forward?
Okay, that's a good spot, and it probably reflected the fact that I only had a half hour, because immigration was a major issue during the Brexit referendum. So, but the polls post Brexit have started to show it's somewhat dropped off the concerns of the British public. You know, in that the exiting Europe. The British government has talked about immigration in the future being the sort of more akin to a sort of Australian points type system, where the government would identify the type of immigrants that it wants. You know, in the lockdown period, because of lockdown, obviously immigration is simply not happening anywhere in Europe. No one's moving around. And even no one's likely to move around Europe. The way things are going in Europe, it looks as if it will take to the end of 2021 before European borders are going to start to open up again. But immigration was a major driving factor in Brexit. You know, skepticism about immigration, and it remains an issue. But I mean, in a sense, if you're a EU citizen, you now can't move to Britain. If you're a British citizen, you can't move to Europe. You know, that's the situation at the moment. You go through a bureaucracy in the same way that I would go through a bureaucracy if I happened to get a job in America, or likewise an American moving to the UK. Although there are ways. There's a lot of Brits that are rediscovering their Irish ancestry, you know, or their Polish ancestry, or whatever. You know, if my sister would ever give me my dad's birth certificate to apply for an Irish passport, I'll be doing it this year. But her passport application has been locked up in the sort of the Irish consulate for some time now. So. And it's not problematic, of course, now, because we can't go anywhere. No one can but the rules in the UK at the moment are I can't actually leave. I can't go within technically I shouldn't be going out with a 10-mile radius of the city of Glasgow, you know. So, but that's about to open up here. So okay. in the next week or two.
So stay where you are. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So
David.
Yeah, so we have another question that comes back to one of the earlier slides you had about identity issues of the British. And the participant asked that you mentioned the difference in political opinions between those who identify as British versus those who identify as English. What other differences exist between those two groups? Or are there other significant things that impact those group identities?
Yeah, I mean, there is a significant differences even on a basis of ethnicities amongst the English, that the Black and ethnic minority population are much more likely to identify as British than English. You know, largely because of recent migration or recent immigration, that their citizenship status is reflective of a British passport, you know, and that's what they see. It's British institutions that they've dealt with in terms of their migration. The Home Office here, which is the Department of State, you know, is different. But there is definitely a sense of as you move out with metropolitan areas, the sense of English identity becomes much more apparent. And as I suggested in the presentation, that probably a more inward view of the world, you know, a more small town view of the world, you know, or a more rural view, or a more nostalgic view of the world, you know, that the nostalgia being that of Britain as Rule Britannia, that the Britain with an empire, you know, a more nationalistic view, whereas, you know, those who are identifying as British, perhaps having a more globalistic view. Now, that is to a degree, in a way, replicated in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland is a. Let's not get into Irish politics. We could be here. We could be here forever. You know, that really is about British and Irish identity, and what state you want to belong to. Scotland. I mean, Scotland. In Scotland, if you primarily have a Scottish identity, it's somewhat inversed in that you tend to be more liberal or more social democratic than the unionist side. The unionist side is associated with the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party is the primary unionist party in Scotland. Well, the Labour Party, well, at the moment, in the current Scottish elections, the key battleground is between the Labour and Conservative Party to come second. Which one will come second? You know, so one's the sort of socialist or left of centre, what you would think of as the Democrats, and one's the Republicans. And then you've got the nationalists who are going to gain about 50% of the vote, and they are more primarily associated with the sort of leftist Labour type ideology, with the case being for Scottish an independence case. And they're utilising the unpopularity of Boris Johnson and his government as making the case for an independent Scotland. Essentially, who do you want to make decisions for you? Do you want him, this Boris Johnson, or do you want a Scottish government in Edinburgh to make those decisions? And that's the narrative that they're looking to put forth.
Okay. Maybe then as a follow-up, you know, if there's another Scottish referendum, there is a vote towards independence, what would the political and economic implications for the UK be in a situation where Scotland has independence?
Yeah, that's Scotland. In terms of Scotland is only a nation of, I think, about 5.3 million people, in a UK population of about 66 million. So it's a relative, it's 9% of the UK population. That said, the Scottish land border might not be quite hard, but because of its location, and the sea border of Scotland is actually much, much larger than that of England, because there are no countries near Scotland. You know, if you take aside, leave Ireland out, you know, the North Atlantic area. And so it has very significant implications in the sense that Britain's nuclear weapons and nuclear arsenal is located within Scotland. You know, it's only about 25 miles from where I'm sitting right now in Glasgow. And even the US has a submarine base just about on the west coast of Scotland. So it has implications also for NATO, and as regards would Scotland be a member of NATO, because there's a real political struggle inside the nationalist movement about becoming more like Ireland, which is a more neutral country within Europe, or more like a Scandinavian country. But I think, those would be the dismantling of nuclear weapons is a very lengthy process that would take decades, and moving bases and things like that. It would be. This would all be up for negotiation in an independent Scotland, and the case for an independent Scotland is hampered somewhat by what currency would an independent Scotland use. You know, would it retain the pound? Could it retain the pound? You know, if Scotland wanted to be a member of the EU, technically it should state that in the longer term it would join the euro. But there are many countries inside the EU that are still not in the euro. You know, and they can say they aspire to it without actually doing anything. You know, so but there's all sorts of debates about that. And then there's the border issue. You know, would there have to be, despite there never being a border for centuries, would Scotland have to have a border with England? You know, so the replication of the sort of Irish border dispute that's been going on. Technically, it may well have to. You know.
Okay, well, we'll wait to hear what happens with the Scottish referendum when it happens. So we'll come back to you and have another session. But I think tonight we are going to have to wrap up. We still have a number of questions, but this could go on for quite some time, and I want to be respectful. We want to be respectful of everyone's time this evening. Neil, thanks so much. Really appreciated your willingness with a 6 or 7 hour time difference.
Yeah, well, I think we're about 1:30 a.m. here.
You're doing very well for 1:30 a.m. So thank you very much. For everyone who joined us, thank you for coming into this conversation. As a reminder, the last one will be held in 2 weeks on April 14. And until then, thank you for joining us and have a good evening. Good night.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Neil.
Thank you,
Thanks,
guys.
everyone.
Thank you. Take care.